Are you seeking fulfillment for your life? Do you want freedom from fear? That's why we're here. Welcome to Jesus 101, introducing you to the real Jesus. And now, here's your host, Elizabeth Talbot.
Welcome to Jesus 101. I am Elizabeth Talbot, and today we are starting our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We are going to go over the whole Gospel, or at least most of it together, in the next few programs. But before we go there, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had bad news and you were waiting for good news, and the whole thing depended on one person that could bring you those good news? Well, I've been there. My father had cancer. It was a very, very aggressive cancer, stomach cancer. And it looked like his life was over. This was about 8 years ago. And a doctor came and said, we think we can get his cancer. So we went to the hospital, a very, very large surgery. They took 90% of his stomach out. And we were waiting for 6-7 hours. And then all of a sudden he started walking towards us, and we stood up and we were trying to read, every muscle in his face. Have you ever been there? And he seemed to be walking in slow motion and not moving until he got to us. Everything we knew was dependent on this one man. When he opened his mouth, what he said. And he said, "Good news, the cancer is out." And then he continued talking, but I don't remember what he said, because I wanted to tell everybody that was waiting there in the waiting room, good news, the cancer is out. Well, my dad is still alive and he's in great health, and we praise God for that. But this is a similar situation to the one that the people in the time of Matthew are facing. Everything is bad news for them. They actually are oppressed in many levels. Talk about economic hard times or political hard times. Well, the political situation is very bad. They're under the Roman Empire, and they're oppressed in many ways. The economic situation is not that good. Very few people in society own the whole land. Everybody else is, working for somebody else. And religious oppression is also there. The Pharisees are hard. They are exacting heavy burdens. Matthew constantly is at odds with the religious leadership of Judaism. He talks about their synagogues, and he says they have a heavy burden on people. So constantly, the people in Matthew's community are searching the scriptures for this one person that was to come. The scriptures had two very specific people that they were waiting for. One was a king like David. There were many prophecies in the Old Testament that the Davidic king was going to come, and when he came, a new age would start. So they were expecting a Davidic king. 2 Samuel chapter 7 was a covenant that God made with David and said, your kingdom will be everlasting. But later on through the prophets, as you search the scriptures, you find something interesting, and I'm going to read it in English. Ezekiel chapter 34. God says, "A time is coming when I am sending the one person you were waiting for." Chapter 34, you might read it at home. Everything is going bad. The sheep of Israel are scattered, and the shepherds don't seem to care. So on verse 11, God says, "Behold, I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out." And it goes on to say, I'm going to give them rest. I'm going to feed them. And how is God going to do that? Well, he says on verse 23, "I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David." Now, this is hundreds of years after David. We're talking about the David that was to come. "My servant David, and he will feed them, and he will feed them himself and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken." So when we get to the time of Matthew, Everybody's waiting for this one person to bring good news. The Davidic king, the one that finally will do what they need. But there's another person they're waiting for. It's from the law. You know Moses, who gave them the law? Well, Moses himself said that there would be a prophet like him that would come. This is a prophecy that you find in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, verse 15. Moses says there, a prophet like me will come. Well, when he arrives, well, you should listen to him, because I'm only the first part of God's revelation. I gave you the law, but a prophet like Moses is coming. So these are the two people you need to remember when you read the Gospel of Matthew. The new David king, the new shepherd king that would come in the Davidic line. He would come with the good news. And there would be a prophet like Moses, the new and greater Moses that would come. So these two persons are constantly portrayed in the Gospel of Matthew. So much so that the whole Gospel is narrated in a way that the Jewish people would connect it with these two great names of the history of Israel. Even in the first verse of Matthew, you have that Jesus was the son of David. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. But in the Gospel of Matthew, because Jesus is also the new and greater Moses, Matthew will divide his whole Gospel in 5 discourses. This is very important because Moses had written 5 books, remember? And so Matthew will say, well, this is the new and greater Moses, and he has come to guide us for this new time. This is the one we were expecting from the prophecy. So each one of these discourses ends up with the same sentence, when Jesus finished saying these things. So each one of these discourses ends up with the same sentence. The first discourse is chapters 5 to 7. We call this the Kingdom's Manifesto. The second one is chapter 10, and is the kingdom's mission, when Jesus explains what this new kingdom looks like. Chapter 13 is the kingdom's parables. We have more than 8 parables that show what this new kingdom will be like. Then we have chapter 18, which is called the kingdom's community. How do we treat people inside this community of the kingdom? And then we have the final discourse, chapter 24 and 25, the kingdom's future. Okay, so we have kingdom's manifesto, kingdom's mission, kingdom's parables, kingdom's community, and kingdom's future. Now, this was very important because Matthew will take all of this and make his gospel from these 5 discourses and just insert material in between. Now, you would say, well, why would he do that? Well, he did that because of the expectation that the new Moses and the new David were coming. Oh, yes, the people in Matthew's times really, really needed good news. Do you need good news? Well, maybe you are facing yourself some oppression. Perhaps it's economical, perhaps it's political, or maybe even religious. Well, if you're needing good news, the Gospel of Matthew is the gospel for you. Because in this gospel, Matthew will say, ta-da! Jesus has come. He is the King. He is the new Moses, and he's bringing good news with him.
You're watching Jesus 101.
Welcome back to Jesus 101. I am holding a balloon because in many countries, including the United States, when there's an election and somebody wins, well, we get hundreds of balloons that fall. And we all celebrate because there's a new government that has started. Well, maybe you live in one of those countries and you've seen the many balloons fall. Matthew is written in this expectation that a new ruler is about to take over. We've been waiting for this ruler throughout Scripture. As a matter of fact, we know he would be of the Davidic line. And we're almost ready to throw the balloons throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And he will make a point to let us know that this ruler is the Davidic king we've been waiting for. And he will do that from the very beginning. But you see here a sign that says paradox? Well, is because in the middle of the gospel, we'll find out that the way that this kingdom will get started, nobody imagined. Nobody imagined that the way that this ruler will come to power would be death. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go to the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 1, verse 1, the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David. See, here you have it from the very beginning. And Matthew makes such a clear point on this, that he, throughout the first 17 verses, will give the genealogy of Jesus to show that they're divided in 3 segments of 14. Well, you might say, well, why 14, right? Well, let's read verse 17. All the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Well, in order to do that, he had to pass over many other generations that he didn't count, because he's not making a historical point. He's actually making a theological point. And this would be the descendant of David. The word David in Hebrew has a number. You know, they have numbers for the consonants, and DVD is 464, so it adds up to 14. So now you get it. Well, throughout the gospel, it seems like things are going fine. Maybe that was the first half of your life, right? It seems like we're right on track. Things are happening. You know, my life was like that. Plan A, and just in case that failed, plan B, and just in case that failed, plan C. Well, it seems like we're on track. Jesus is doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing. Even when we get to chapter 21, well, it looks that this is the moment that he will become king. Like I said, the balloons are about to fall. He's about to do a victory speech. Chapter 21, verse 1. When they had approached Jerusalem and had come to Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied there and a colt with her. Untie and bring it to me." I can imagine the disciples saying, "This is the time. This is the time we've been waiting for. David is about to get his throne." I'm sure you've been there. When you see the little cloud coming and it looks like it's going to rain finally. So they're all excited. And Jesus allows something that we would have never thought. He allows himself to be sitting on this donkey like if he really was going to be crowned king. Verse 4, this is the way Matthew explains it. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Remember, Matthew is always trying to show that the Old Testament is fulfilled in Jesus. And he says in verse 5, "Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey." This is actually a prophecy from Isaiah, chapter 62, verse 11, if you want to check it out. And then he goes on, "Even on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." Now, that's another prophecy, Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. See, Matthew is filled with prophecies because he wants to show that this is the king. And look at the titles people are calling Jesus. Verse 9, the crowds going ahead of him and those who follow him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Oh, Son of David, we've been waiting for you so long. And it goes on, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." But then comes the paradox. Have you ever been caught between what seems logic and God's will? You know, this is God's will. This is what looks logic. And you're caught in between. Well, I have. Sometimes I have been asked by God to do something that made no sense. And so the disciples think this is what's making sense. What's making sense is that Jesus is about to be crowned king. Haven't we been waiting for him the whole Old Testament long? Nobody could imagine chapter 27 in chapter 21. Chapter 21 is the triumphal entry. But chapter 27 is Jesus' crucifixion. Chapter 27 actually is narrated in the words of David. Because see, David had written a psalm, Psalm 22. And Matthew will use all of Psalm 22 from David to explain that this was no surprise, yes, it's paradoxical, because who can imagine a Messiah crucified, right? That's the paradox. But he had written a psalm, Psalm 22, that starts, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Jesus will utter those very words from the cross. See Matthew 27, verse 46. My God, why have you forsaken me? But that's not all that Matthew does. Look in Matthew chapter 27, verse 35. When they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. You know what? That was already in Psalm 22. Check out Psalm 22, verse 18. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. And there's a lot more throughout this narrative that David will explain, that Matthew says, oh, there was a prophecy that the Messiah would be crucified. How about this? Verse 43. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he delights in him. For he said, I am the Son of God. Well, that's verse 8 on chapter 22. Let God rescue him. And we have things like this one after the other. For example, verse 16 on chapter 22 of Psalm. They pierced my hands and my feet. How could David have known 1,000 years before Christ that Jesus, in order to become king, will go through the cross? See, sometimes in life, we face the paradoxes that Matthew is trying to tell us. Everybody is really, really excited that the balloons are about to fall, right? Everybody's ready to crown Jesus king. Nobody understands that the cross is actually the way he will become king. That the cross is actually the way this whole kingdom will be established. If you are caught today between what makes sense and God's will, well, remember the cross, because God has a different view of things than the one we do. And in the moment that it looked like Jesus was being defeated as king, well, actually at that moment, he was receiving his kingdom. And made this message, this paradoxical message of a crucified Messiah, encourage you today.
You're watching Jesus 101.
Welcome back to Jesus 101. We left our previous segment in the paradox of a crucified Messiah. They never realized that the way that Jesus would become the king would be through the cross. And we talked about being caught between what makes sense and God's will. Have you ever been there? Well, Matthew's audience is there because Matthew's trying to say that when they realized that Jesus was the king, and he even entered Jerusalem on a donkey, it looked like he really, really was about to be crowned king. But then his death came. And in the very words of King David from Psalm 22, the whole narrative of the crucifixion is using all these prophecies from Psalm 22. They have pierced my hands and my feet. They cast lots for my garments. How could David have known, right, 1,000 years before, that Jesus would be crucified? You know, many times we think that the things that are happening in our lives are heading the right way, and then we get this wall, and we don't know what to do with that wall. It's a paradoxical wall. When we thought we were closer, but you know, in the moment Jesus is going to his death, he's closer to achieving his kingdom than he's ever been. But he doesn't know that, at least Matthew doesn't know that. He realizes this is the mission why he came, but he's suffering. And maybe you're closer to your dreams than you've ever been, but you know, it doesn't look anything like you thought it would. So here we're in this paradox. But Matthew wants us to know that even though Jesus is dying, at the very moment that he's dying, really, the kingdom is coming. See, throughout the Gospel of Matthew, we have this type of thinking called already but not yet. Matthew talks a lot about this. The kingdom is already here, but not yet fully here. Jesus has come and is among us and will accomplish on the cross what he came to do. But Jesus has not taken over the world yet, and we're hoping he will do that very soon. So we live in this between time, between the already and not yet. We know it's a done deal because he said it on the cross, it is finished. But he hasn't come yet to take over and take us home. So we also, like the Matthean community, live in this between time, between already and not yet. So one of the things that Matthew does in the death of Jesus, in the way he narrates his death, he shows us that this is the moment where all the expectations of the Messiah are actually coming true in the moment he dies. So come with me to Matthew chapter 27, verse 50. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, look how dramatic this is. There's no gospel writer that writes so dramatically regarding his death. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom to show God's intervention. And the earth shook and the rocks were split. This tremendous earthquake is taking place. And then Matthew says on verse 52, the tombs were open. The tombs were open. And many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tomb after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. See, Matthew can't wait to tell you that there's good news even though Jesus is dying. Perhaps you have lost a loved one and you would love so much to believe that really in the moment Jesus dies, death is conquered forever and for good. And that is always a wonderful belief to have when we lose somebody that we love. And you see, the Old Testament had this expectation that when the Davidic king came, he would have power over death and many people would resurrect. That's why Matthew, in the moment Jesus dies, can't even wait till Sunday morning. He has to say it that day, at that moment, on Friday night, that all these people were raised from the dead. Well, he says, they came out of the tombs on Sunday morning. Well, the point that he's trying to make is actually that Jesus is the Messianic King we've been waiting for. And that at the moment he dies, well, at that moment, we have power over death. And the way that he tells of the resurrection, well, it's fantastic. Let me take you there. Chapter 28 of Matthew, verse 1 and 2. After the Sabbath, as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, and an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat on it. Remember on that program where we introduced all the Gospels, we talked about this throne language, this control language, and the angel comes and rolls away the stone and he sits on it. Just to show that, well, death is over with for good. Yes, I understand that we still have family dying and we still have friends that are dying, and it doesn't look like God has taken over death. That's it. Well, that's because we are between the already and the not yet. The already says that Jesus actually does already have power over death, and he resurrected himself. But the not yet says, well, very soon he will come and resurrect all those people that have believed in him. So we are caught in between. And the angel in Matthew's version of the gospel not only rolls away the stone of death, but he sits on it. Isn't that a wonderful visualization of the power of Jesus Christ? Well, see, Matthew has been trying all along to tell us that Jesus really is the Davidic king that we have been waiting for. He is the one that is holding the crown. He is the one that throughout scriptures we've been waiting for. He is the Davidic king. He is of the line of David, and 14 generations. Remember chapter 1? He's all about David. And it's very interesting that Matthew will finish his gospel with actually a speech of victory. You know, like if elections had come, You know, I was telling you that in many countries we celebrate elections and the victory of the new president with balloons that fall. And maybe you live in one of those countries. Here in the United States, we have this great celebration when there is a new government that takes place. Well, Matthew will finish with Jesus' victory speech. Jesus will give a speech that will actually say that he is the new king. And this is how it reads. And I'm going to read on chapter 28, starting with verse 18. And don't forget, we've been expecting the balloons to fall throughout the whole gospel because it's almost here. And so Jesus, this is the way he says goodbye. All authority has been given to me on heaven and on earth. Oh, yes, says Jesus, the victory speech is here. The balloons are actually falling, and I am the king. I am the king. And yes, it was a paradox. Yes, the crown came through the cross, but finally, all authority has been given to me on heaven and on earth. And may this speech of Jesus encourage you no matter what you're facing today.